My name is Sarah. I am 24 years old, and I still remember the freezing temperature of my tiny apartment when the phone rang, shattering the quiet life I had built. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the voice introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, a 60-year-old probate lawyer representing the estate of Richard, the impossibly wealthy man my mother had chosen over her own flesh and blood. 5 years ago, my mother packed her bags in the dead of night, leaving a pathetic handwritten note on the kitchen counter that said she finally had a chance at a real life of luxury that didn't include a struggling teenage daughter holding her back. For half a decade, I carried that rejection like a physical weight in my chest, a constant burning reminder that I was not enough for the woman who gave me life. I had buried her memory and forced myself to move on through sheer willpower. But now, this stranger was telling me that Richard had passed away unexpectedly, and that before he took his last breath, he had explicitly instructed his legal team to find the daughter his wife had thrown away. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as Mr. Harrison took a slow breath and revealed the single, earth-shattering reason he was calling me today. Before I reveal the shocking truth of what that lawyer told me and how it turned my world upside down, I want to take a brief moment to ask you something. I would love to know from which city or state you are listening to my story right now, because it always brings me a strange sense of comfort to see how far my words can travel. Please drop your location in the comments, as I really enjoy reading them and feeling connected to all of you. Now, to truly make you understand the sheer magnitude of that phone call and why my reaction was so visceral, I need to take you back to the very beginning. I need to take you back to 5 years ago, to the days when I still believed that a mother's love was supposed to be unconditional and unbreakable. Back then, I was a 19-year-old girl trying to navigate the overwhelming transition between high school and adulthood in a dreary suburb of Seattle. My mother, Linda, who was 40 years old at the time, was my entire world, mostly because it had always been just the two of us against a universe that seemed determined to keep us struggling. We lived paycheck to paycheck in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where the heater rattled like a dying engine. I worked exhausting shifts at a local grocery store, scanning endless rows of canned goods until my fingers were numb, handing over every single dollar I earned to help her pay the rent. I thought we were a team, sharing cheap instant noodles while dreaming of a day when we would not have to check our bank balances before buying coffee. I genuinely believed she looked at me with pride, seeing a daughter who was sacrificing her own teenage years to ensure our survival. But everything began to fracture the moment Richard entered our lives. Richard was a 55-year-old real estate developer who possessed the kind of effortless wealth that allowed him to look right through people who did not belong to his elite social circle. My mother met him at a charity gala she sneaked into while working as a server, and from that very first night, a dark, greedy obsession took root in her eyes. Suddenly, the woman who used to laugh with me over burnt toast was spending hours applying expensive cosmetics purchased on secret credit cards. She started coming home late, smelling of heavy perfume, her arms full of designer shopping bags that she would hide in her closet. The tension grew so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. When I finally mustered the courage to confront her about the massive pile of unpaid utility bills stacked on the counter, begging her to explain where her portion of the rent money had gone, Linda did not even look guilty. She simply adjusted the glittering diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Richard, and looked at me with utter disdain, telling me she was tired of living like a peasant. It was the first time I truly saw the cold, calculating stranger hiding beneath my mother's skin. The devastating climax of her transformation happened on a Tuesday. I had just returned home from a brutal 10-hour shift at the grocery store, my feet aching and my uniform smelling of stale produce. I walked into the living room and found my mother frantically stuffing her clothes into brand new, expensive leather suitcases. Panic instantly gripped my throat. I dropped my worn-out backpack on the floor and ran toward her, grabbing her arm and begging her to tell me what was going on, asking if we were finally being evicted. She violently yanked her arm away, her eyes hard and devoid of any maternal warmth. She told me that Richard had asked her to move into his sprawling mansion in the hills, but he had made one very strict condition.
He did not want any excess baggage from her past life ruining his pristine home. And in his eyes, a 19-year-old daughter who worked at a grocery store was the absolute definition of excess baggage. I stood there in the center of our dingy living room, completely paralyzed, my brain refusing to process the monstrous words that had just casually spilled from her lips. I asked her, my voice cracking into a desperate whisper, if she was really going to leave me behind for a man she had known for barely 4 months? Linda zipped up her final suitcase with a sharp sound that echoed like a gunshot. She grabbed her designer purse, walked right past me without offering a single hug or a tear, and paused at the front door just long enough to deliver her final blow. She said that I was an adult now, that it was time for me to figure out my own life, and that she could not let my failures prevent her from finally being happy. The door clicked shut behind her, and the crushing silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I have ever experienced.
I collapsed onto the cheap carpet, pulling my knees to my chest, and screamed until my throat bled, shattered by the realization that my own mother had calculated my worth and decided I was cheaper than a mansion. The next few weeks were a relentless descent into pure survival mode. With my mother gone, the entire burden of our overdue rent and utility bills fell squarely onto my unprepared shoulders. The eviction notice was taped to my door exactly 21 days after she left, a bright neon orange piece of paper that loudly broadcasted my ultimate failure. If it had not been for my best friend Emily, a fiercely loyal 24-year-old woman who worked the cash register next to mine at the grocery store, I would have ended up sleeping on the unforgiving city streets. Emily found me having a massive panic attack in the break room, clutching that eviction notice in my shaking hands. Without asking a single question, she dragged me to her own tiny apartment and pointed to a lumpy sofa in the corner. She told me the sofa was mine for as long as I needed it, and that we were going to figure out a plan together.
Emily became the family I had violently lost. She saved my life when the woman who gave birth to me decided my life was not worth saving. For the next 2 years, my existence was a brutal grind that tested the absolute limits of my physical endurance. I quit the grocery store and found a job at a high-volume diner downtown where the tips were better, but the physical toll was infinitely worse. I worked chaotic double shifts, balancing massive trays of scalding hot food, enduring the screaming of an angry kitchen staff, and dealing with rude, entitled customers. But every single time I felt like collapsing, I pictured my mother's cold, dismissive eyes as she walked out that door. I used my intense, boiling anger as fuel. I saved every single dime, stuffing the money into a locked metal box under Emily's sofa, slowly building a wall of financial security between myself and the terrifying abyss of poverty. By the time the 3rd year rolled around, the agonizing hard work finally began to yield life-altering results.
I had saved enough money to rent a small, clean apartment of my very own, a quiet sanctuary where the heater actually worked. I enrolled in night classes at the local community college, studying business administration while continuing to work grueling shifts at the diner during the day. I functioned on 4 hours of sleep, fueled by cheap coffee and an aggressive determination to prove to the universe that I was not disposable trash. By my 4th year of independence, my relentless work ethic caught the attention of the diner's regional manager, who offered me a salaried position as the general manager of a brand new location opening across town. It was a massive leap forward. I finally had health insurance, paid time off, and a salary that allowed me to buy fresh groceries without nervously calculating the total cost in my head. I had built a stable, respectable life with my own 2 hands. Yet, despite my undeniable professional success, the emotional scar left by my mother's betrayal remained deeply etched into my soul, pulsing with a quiet, persistent agony.
I kept my circle of friends incredibly small, trusting only Emily and a few close colleagues. I tried so hard to hate my mother completely, but the cruelest part of being abandoned by a parent is that a tiny, pathetic piece of your inner child always continues to desperately crave their love. That brings me back to that freezing Tuesday afternoon,
exactly 5 years after the day she walked out of my life, sitting in my apartment as the phone rang. When Mr. Harrison, the lawyer representing Richard's estate, told me that Richard had passed away from a sudden heart attack just 3 weeks prior, I felt a strange wave of numbness wash over my entire body. I had never met him, never spoken a single word to him, and yet his wealth and his demands had been the destructive catalyst that obliterated my family. Mr. Harrison's voice was calm and professional as he explained that Richard had left behind a legally binding last will and testament that required an immediate in-person reading.
I told the lawyer, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and deep confusion, that I had absolutely nothing to do with Richard and that he needed to call his grieving widow, Linda. It was then that Mr. Harrison paused, a heavy silence hanging on the line, before he quietly informed me that my mother was already aware of the meeting and that I was legally required to be present because I was explicitly named as a primary beneficiary in the document. The sheer absurdity of the lawyer's statement made my brain completely short-circuit. Why in the world would a man who had specifically demanded that my mother abandon me because I was excess baggage suddenly name me as a primary beneficiary in his will? I paced back and forth across my living room floor, my heart slamming against my ribs, a million terrifying scenarios racing through my mind. I immediately called Emily, my hands trembling so violently I could barely unlock my phone screen, and poured out the entire bizarre conversation to her in a panicked rush.
Emily, always the calm and rational anchor in my chaotic life, told me that I had to go to the lawyer's office. She argued that avoiding the situation out of fear would only give my mother the power to haunt my thoughts forever, and that I needed to face this mystery head-on to finally achieve the closure I so desperately needed. She offered to drive me there and wait in the lobby, providing the emotional armor I needed to step back into the toxic orbit of my past. 2 days later, I found myself standing in front of a towering glass building in the financial district, my stomach churning with violent nausea. Emily squeezed my shoulder reassuringly before taking a seat in the plush leather waiting area, leaving me to walk down the heavily carpeted hallway toward Mr. Harrison's private conference room alone. The heavy oak door felt like a physical barrier between my peaceful present and my traumatic past. I pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat, and the very first thing I saw was her, Linda, my mother.
She was sitting at the far end of a massive mahogany conference table, dressed in a sharp, immaculately tailored black morning suit that probably cost more than my first car. The past 5 years had aged her, but the arrogant, entitled posture remained exactly the same. When she heard the door click shut, she slowly turned her head, her eyes locking onto mine, and for a split second, I saw a flash of genuine panic cross her heavily manicured face. "Sarah," my mother breathed, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, entirely fake tone of maternal affection that instantly made my skin crawl. She stood up, dramatically reaching her arms out toward me, as if we were estranged friends reuniting at a pleasant social gathering, completely ignoring the 5 years of devastating silence. "Look at you. You look so grown up. I have missed you so incredibly much, my sweet girl," she said. I stopped dead in my tracks, refusing to take a single step closer to her, crossing my arms defensively over my chest.
I stared at her, my expression blank, channeling every ounce of the cold resilience I had built while scrubbing dishes and crying on Emily's floor. I told her, my voice eerily calm, to drop the pathetic act because we both knew she had not thought about me for a single second since the day she walked out. Her fake smile instantly vanished, replaced by a tight, angry grimace, her true nature surfacing the moment her manipulation failed to work. She sat back down heavily, crossing her legs and glaring at me with the familiar, toxic disdain I remembered so vividly. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat loudly, breaking the hostile tension in the room, and gestured for me to take a seat on the opposite side of the long table. He began by explaining the vast extent of Richard's estate, listing off luxury properties, massive stock portfolios, and offshore bank accounts. My mother sat up straighter, her eyes gleaming with undisguised greed, nervously tapping her diamond-ringed fingers against the polished wood of the table.
She was completely ready to claim her ultimate prize, the massive fortune she had sacrificed her only daughter to secure. But then Mr. Harrison flipped to a specific page marked with a red tab, took a deep breath, and announced that Richard had drastically altered his entire will exactly 2 months before his fatal heart attack. He stated that Richard had hired a private investigator and uncovered a devastating truth about his marriage. The lawyer looked directly at my mother, his expression a mask of pure professional detachment, and read Richard's final words aloud. Richard had discovered that Linda had been carrying on a passionate, highly expensive affair with a much younger personal trainer for the past 3 years. She had been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from Richard's accounts to buy her lover expensive sports cars and a high-end condominium downtown. Richard, a man who possessed a massive ego and a terrifying temper, was consumed by a burning desire for absolute revenge. He knew he was dying, and he wanted to punish my mother in the most agonizing, humiliating way possible. Mr. Harrison then turned his gaze toward me, his eyes softening just a fraction, and delivered the final world-shattering blow. He read that Richard had spent his final months quietly observing my life from a distance, having his investigators compile reports on my struggles, my relentless hard work at the diner, and my eventual success as a manager. Richard wrote that while he had initially demanded my mother leave me behind because he despised weakness, he had ultimately realized that Linda was the true parasite, and I was the one who possessed genuine strength and character. Therefore, Richard legally revoked every single prenuptial agreement and spousal benefit, leaving Linda with absolutely nothing. Zero. Not a single dollar, not a single property, not even the designer clothes in her closet, which were legally owned by his estate. Instead, he left the entirety of his liquid assets, totaling over $12 million, entirely and exclusively to me. I sat there in the heavy leather chair, the air completely knocked out of my lungs, the massive sum of money echoing in my brain like a thunderclap. The silence in the conference room lasted for exactly 3 seconds before my mother absolutely erupted into a violent, screaming frenzy. She slammed her hands down on the mahogany table, leaping to her feet, her face contorted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure rage. She screamed at Mr. Harrison that the document was a disgusting forgery, that Richard was out of his mind, and that she would tie the estate up in endless litigation until the day she died. When the lawyer calmly informed her that Richard had anticipated her reaction and had subjected himself to 3 independent psychiatric evaluations to prove his mental competence, she turned her venomous fury onto me. She lunged across the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face, screaming that I was a manipulative thief who had somehow conned a dying man out of the fortune that rightfully belonged to her. She demanded that I sign the money over to her immediately, claiming that she was her mother and that I owed her everything.
I slowly stood up from my chair, feeling a profound, incredible sense of calm wash over my entire being, completely extinguishing the anxiety that had plagued me for 5 long years. I looked at this screaming, desperate woman, stripped of her wealthy facade, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy pity. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her that she lost the right to call herself my mother the night she walked out of our apartment and left me to starve. I told her that she had traded me for a mansion, and now she was going to have to live with the agonizing reality that her abandoned daughter owned the very ground she walked on. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I simply delivered the cold, hard truth with a quiet authority that made her physically recoil. I picked up my purse, thanked Mr. Harrison for his time, and turned my back on her for the absolute last time. The legal process of transferring the massive inheritance took several exhausting months, but when the millions finally hit my bank account,
The very first thing I did was purchase Emily a beautiful, fully paid off house in a quiet neighborhood, ensuring that the incredible woman who saved my life would never have to worry about an eviction notice ever again. I quit my demanding job and established a substantial charitable foundation dedicated to providing emergency financial assistance to young adults who had been abruptly abandoned by their families. As for my mother, the consequences of her profound greed were absolute and inescapable. Richard's legal team aggressively enforced the eviction from his mansion, giving her exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal items she had purchased with her own funds before changing the locks. I received several frantic, deeply manipulative letters from her over the next year, begging for forgiveness and demanding financial support, claiming she was living in a terrible motel. I took every single one of those letters, dropped them unopened into the small paper shredder in my office, and watched her toxic words turn into meaningless confetti.
I felt no guilt, no remorse, and no desire to save her from the miserable reality she had so carefully constructed for herself. She had made her choice 5 years ago, and now she was forced to live in the permanent shadow of that devastating decision. Looking back at that terrified, heartbroken 19-year-old girl crying on the kitchen floor, I realize now that the most painful moment of my entire life was actually the greatest gift I could have ever received. Being abandoned forced me to discover a deep, unbreakable well of strength and resilience inside myself that I never would have found if I had remained comfortably dependent on a toxic parent. I learned the hard way that family is not always defined by shared blood or genetics. True family is defined by the people who choose to stand by your side when your entire world is falling apart. I often wonder what you would have done if you were standing in my shoes in that lawyer's office, staring at the woman who threw you away.
Would you have shown her mercy and shared the money? Or would you have walked away and let her face the consequences of her own betrayal, just like I did? Until the next story.